Two men walking along a dusty riverbank in California, carrying everything they own on their backs. One of them is small, sharp, tired. The other is enormous, gentle, and doesn't quite understand the world the way other people do. They're heading toward a ranch job that will last, at best, a few weeks. And yet, walking beside the river, the big one asks the small one to tell him, again, about the future, about the rabbits, about the little house, about the place that will finally be theirs. It's a story they've told each other 100 times. And by the end of this book, you'll understand exactly why they keep telling it, and exactly why it was never going to come true. This is Of Mice and Men, published in 1937. It's short. You can read it in an afternoon, but it might be the most quietly devastating novel in the American curriculum. Let's go inside it. Steinbeck sets the story in the Salinas Valley of California during the Great Depression, a period when millions of Americans had lost their jobs, their homes, their land. Among the hardest hit were agricultural workers, men who traveled from ranch to ranch, farm to farm, taking whatever seasonal labor they could find, with no permanent home and often no one to rely on but themselves. These men were called bindle-stiffs, a bindle being the bedroll, and few possessions they carried on their backs. They were, by the nature of the work, almost always alone. Ranches hired them for a task, bucking barley, picking fruit, and let them go the moment the job was finished. Loneliness wasn't just a theme Steinbeck chose. It was the literal, structural condition of this entire class of American worker, which is what makes George Milton and Lennie Small so unusual. They travel together. In a world built around solitary men, they have each other, and that single fact becomes the emotional center of the entire novel. George is small, quick-witted, and endlessly frustrated by the responsibility he carries. Lennie is a giant of a man, immensely strong, with the mental capacity of a young child. He loves soft things, mice, puppies, velvet, hair, and he doesn't always know his own strength. Earlier, before the novel begins, Lennie's affection for a woman's soft dress got the two of them run out of their last town, accused of something far worse than what actually happened. It's a pattern we'll see again, with much higher stakes. They arrive at a new ranch near the town of Soledad, and Soledad, notably, is the Spanish word for solitude. Steinbeck doesn't do that by accident. Almost immediately, Steinbeck gives us the emotional engine of the entire book, the dream. George and Lennie share a fantasy, modest by most standards, but impossibly large for men in their position. A few acres of land, a small house, a garden, some rabbits that Lennie gets to tend and pet. Independence from bosses, from bunkhouses, from being at the mercy of other men's decisions. Someday, we're going to get the jack together and we're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land. George recites it almost like a prayer, and Lennie, who struggles with most abstract things, has this story memorized word for word. It's not just a plan, it's a ritual. Every time things get hard, every time Lennie is frightened or ashamed, George tells him the dream again, and it calms him instantly. Here's what's easy to miss on a first read. The dream isn't really about the land. It's about the promise it represents, that these two men matter to each other, that their lives are heading somewhere, that they are not just drifting anonymously the way every other ranch hand around them does. Later in the novel, an old one-handed ranch worker named Candy overhears the dream and offers his life savings to help buy the land. For one brief chapter, the fantasy nearly becomes real. Steinbeck is directly invoking the mythology of the American dream here. The idea that hard work and self-reliance can lift anyone into ownership and independence. But he's also quietly building the case that for men like George and Lennie, the system was never built to let that dream land safely. Once George and Lennie start work, Steinbeck surrounds them with a cast of characters who each represent a different shape of loneliness. Candy, the aging swamper who lost his hand in an accident, is terrified of being deemed useless and discarded. A fear made literal early in the novel when the other men convince him to let his old, blind dog be shot, because the dog has outlived its usefulness. Candy doesn't stop them. He just lies there, listening. It's one of the quietest, cruelest scenes in American literature, and it's a direct foreshadowing of what will eventually happen to Lennie. Crooks is the black stable hand, forced by racial segregation to live alone in the barn, separate from the other workers. He's intelligent, sharp-tongued, and starved for company. And when Lennie wanders into his room one night, Crooks admits, almost involuntarily, how corrosive that isolation has become. A guy needs somebody to be near him, he says. It's the clearest statement of the novel's core theme, coming from the character with the least power to escape his isolation. And then there's Curly's wife, never given a name of her own in the entire novel, which is itself Steinbeck's point. She's the boss's son's new wife, young, isolated on a ranch full of men who see her only as trouble, dismissed as flirtatious and dangerous by everyone around her. But what she actually wants, as she admits in her final conversation, is simply someone to talk to. She once dreamed of being in the movies. Now she's trapped in a house with a husband she doesn't love, surrounded by men who won't even speak to her directly for fear of being blamed for it. Every one of these characters wants exactly what George and Lennie have, someone who sees them as more than temporary, disposable labor. Steinbeck builds the ending with the same mechanism Lennie can't control, gentle affection that turns, without warning, into destruction. Lennie has already, earlier in the story, accidentally killed a puppy by petting it too hard. It's a small, devastating preview of what's coming. He simply does not have the ability to modulate his own strength, and he panics when things go wrong, which only makes his grip tighten further. Curly's wife, lonely and desperate for someone to talk to, finds Lennie alone in the barn one afternoon. She lets him touch her hair, something he's been fantasizing about because it reminds him of the soft things he loves. He grips too hard. She panics and starts to scream. Terrified she'll get him in trouble the way the woman in the dress did back in their last town, Lennie tries to make her stop, and in his panic, he accidentally breaks her neck. He doesn't understand, even afterward, the scale of what he's done. He remembers only George's instructions from earlier in the book. If you ever get in trouble, run to the brush by the river and hide there until I come find you. The other men discover the body and immediately organize a manhunt, led by Curly, who wants Lennie dead for what he did to his wife, and, unspoken, for years of resentment at being smaller and weaker than a man everyone considers simple-minded. George finds Lennie first, hiding exactly where he told him to. And here is the final unbearable choice of the novel. George knows that if the other men reach Lennie first, he'll be caught, likely tortured, and certainly killed in a way far crueler than anything George could offer him. So George sits beside his friend one last time, tells him the dream of the little house and the rabbits one final time, and, as Lennie stares out peacefully toward the imagined future, George shoots him. It is, within the logic of the novel, presented as an act of mercy. It is also, unmistakably, a murder, committed by the one person who loved Lennie most in the world. The title comes from a line in a Robert Burns poem, written more than a century before Steinbeck. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft agly. The best laid plans of mice and men often go wrong. Steinbeck is telling you before the story even begins exactly how it will end. This isn't a spoiler he's hiding. It's the entire argument of the book, printed on the title page. Of Mice and Men isn't really asking whether George and Lennie's dream will come true. It's asking what dreams are for, when the world you live in was never built to let people like you keep them. Steinbeck lived through the Great Depression watching migrant workers exploited by landowners who saw them as interchangeable, disposable labor. Every character in this book who reaches for connection, dignity, or ownership, Candy, Crooks, Curly's wife, and finally Lennie himself, gets denied it, not because they didn't want it enough, but because the systems around them, economic and social, were never designed to let it land. And underneath that social critique is something even more intimate, a question about what we owe the people we love when love and mercy start to look exactly like loss. George's final act isn't a clean answer. Steinbeck doesn't let you feel good about it, and he doesn't let you feel like George was wrong either. He just makes you sit inside the impossible weight of it, the same way George has to sit beside that river. By the end, the dream, the little house, the rabbits, the acres of land, never becomes real. It was never going to. But for a while it gave two lonely men in an indifferent world a reason to walk toward tomorrow instead of just drifting through it. Steinbeck isn't telling you dreams are pointless. He's telling you that the people who need them most are so often the people the world refuses to let keep them. If this breakdown helped the story click for you, subscribe. We're going through the books your teacher assigned, but nobody actually explained. Next up, the story of a boy who won't survive an island, and what that says about all of us. See you there.